I'm Porcio, TopVelocity.net. We're going to be breaking down Kaden here. It'll be a 3x pitch BioMetrics. Take him into his leg lift. And that's just really looking right before leg drive, position of drive leg. If we go into looking at the hip orientation, we can see the hips are counter-rotated at this point. We see bottom left, the red check, right rotation of the femur. Drive leg femur is 47 degrees internally rotated. So that's because he's so counter-rotated with the hips. At this point, we talked about this before, coming out of leg lift, you'd want your hips to be more in this position here. So you can see when his hips are square, or 180 degrees to the target, or actually 180 degrees in the line, 90 degrees open to open. You can see the drive leg femur is now internally rotated. We'd want to be, say, maybe right here, and that knee still be externally rotated. So holding internal rotation the entire movement causes that back leg to collapse or rotate and doesn't help drive the back hip through. So the hips are stuck going into front foot strike. So the front foot stays really closed, but we hit front foot with no hip rotation. Abduction of right hip is 46 degrees. That is, okay. If you're more externally rotated, that would be more maybe 50. The other key thing is looking at the hip bend, side bend. You can see the blue check is at 22, and then at front foot, it stays at that T mark. We want it to go L, so the hip never moves to. If I was going to get my drawing tool, you can see here, the hip orientation never shifts contralateral. So if that was the hip, it never shifts this way. It always stays down. So that's a collapsing back leg, unfortunately. So the back leg, or the back hip and back leg, that wanting to rotate early, that femur staying internally rotated the majority of the time, put that hip in an unstable position. So if I go back and get my drawing tool, this hip is down. We'd want this hip to be up and going this way, not going this way. Because of that, when you have this hip down, then this arm is unstable, and you can also see that arm's having to really hyper abduct and get into a really hard position. So we got to work right from the beginning with the hip orientation, trying to get the hip orientation all the way into rotation at front foot strike and tilting towards the contralateral side, and that's going to come from holding more external rotation in the drive leg femur and keeping more stability in that back hip. Also, too, we don't want to over lean back towards the rubber as well. That can make it hard for us to stay externally rotated. When you get end of range and abduction, then that back knee wants to turn down into internal rotation or collapse at that point. So, like I said, front foot, hips are late, and then when the hips do get through, we don't have much separation. So if we look at the kinematic sequence here, we can see the red dot is the peak hip, and that is happening at front foot, which is good, but we can see not much of separation between the trunk and the hip at that point. We want to see a bigger separation. Also, too, we see the glove side peak, the blue line or dot, going off before the hip, so that could be help pulling the hip in a rotation. We don't want that. We want that going off with the trunk. Because of that, we can see before the arm even gets up and gets cocked, we got some arm drag that's also going to create arm push later in the movement. So we've got to work on stabilizing hips so we can separate, so then the arm doesn't have to drag so far behind. We get more hip to shoulder separation. So if we look at hip to shoulder separation delta front foot, you can see it was at about 30 degrees, and then as we go in and the hips open, it's at 4 degrees. So definitely showing it as well in positional measurements. If we look at the arm, you can see the arm's really going far and back. the arm is going to do that. The arm's going to load farther back if the trunk and hips aren't separating. So it's going to try to create the separation itself, and that's what creates the arm drag. So if we look at trunk position, we can see the trunk position at front foot strike is leaning back 1 degree, and then it's forward, so it's still leaning forward 14 degrees. So we can see that now we're in an ipsilateral position. So that's a problem. We'd want to be back. The trunk needs to be leaning back. So if I'm getting my tool here, I can show you the trunk needs to be leaning this way, front foot strike, not this way. And because of that, that has a lot to do with that hip. If that hip was through, it would push the trunk back. Same time too, that's gonna, you can see the trunk's now pulling back. We can see now as the shoulder goes and rotates, actually it's still forward, but it's trying to pull back to overcompensate, and that also adds to the drag. So when the trunk has to go leaning forward to leaning back as you go into shoulder rotation, that's going to make the arm want to drag even more as well. So working on landing contralateral with the hip underneath you and also in a contralateral position is going to be critical for arm health. All right, and I think only the last thing that we could look at, maybe go back to that drive. As you can see, more rotation there. We see that the yellow check is at 35 degrees of dorsiflexion, and then as you hit front foot, about 9 degrees. So that's the problem. You can see the ankle's not driving, the knee's not extending, it's just rotating. Like I said, that's causing all the problems, causing the hip to stay unstable, collapse. It's causing the trunk to want to lean towards throwing arm side. Then things don't separate, everything drags. And even though good forward trunk tilt at the end and a good closed front leg position, you can still see the hips are still dipping arm side and the trunk's trying to pull glove side, putting a lot of stress on the arm and ultimately potentially hurting velocity.